Hi, my name is Keith Banting, and I've been doing work on multiculturalism and social integration of migrants, immigrants as we call them in Canada, in the European Union and in Canada. This is an area in which there have been images or perceptions, especially in Europe, of a major backlash against multiculturalism. And it looks as if the Atlantic's getting bigger. That is to say that Europe and North America, Europe and Canada, are going in separate directions. Europe turning its back on multiculturalism, and Canada maintaining its multicultural approach, although a little uneasy about some of the edges of it, but still roughly staying the course. When we look more carefully underneath that image of divergence and continents moving apart, we found a very different picture. When the Europeans talk about turning their back or rejecting multiculturalism, they're using the phrase very differently than we've used it in Canada. When they talk about multiculturalism, they're talking about a strategy of ignoring migrant communities, leaving them relatively separate in relatively segregated enclaves with limited support to learn the language, to integrate into the labor force, to integrate into the mainstream of society, to become citizens. So they use multiculturalism as sort of separate. When we adopt a Canadian conception of multiculturalism, which involves support for migrants to maintain their cultural distinctiveness, but also to move into the mainstream, to make it easier to move into the labor force, to move into social institutions, to become citizens quickly, to participate in our elections and parliamentary systems. When we use that measure of multiculturalism, what we find going on is quite different. That the European pattern is not one of turning their back on multicultural policies where they'd established them. Rather, what they're doing is laying on top a set of programs to try and integrate immigrants more thoroughly. And so many countries are actually moving closer to the Canadian model, even though the image is they're moving further apart. So they're marrying some diversity programs, as they would now call them, with programs designed to make sure immigrants move off social benefits into the labor market, to make sure immigrants learn the language, the customs and history of the country, more emphasis on protecting core liberal democratic values. They're putting a lot of emphasis on these sorts of issues, but those are things that Canadians have done for a long time. So when one looks at this from a slightly more careful perspective, it isn't a sign of Europe rejecting the Canadian model. Some countries are actually moving closer to it. Now, there are some exceptions to this. In the Netherlands, for example, it is clear they are rejecting multiculturalism, even as Canadians understand it. Denmark, another country, has never actually adopted multiculturalism programs as we understand them. And their programs for migrants are very tough. They are, I think, quite illiberal in the pressures they're putting on immigrants. And so I think in those cases, there is a kind of divergence. The Atlantic is getting bigger in those cases. There is a kind of separation, a deep division between the continents on that particular issue. Beyond that, in cases of countries like Sweden, countries like the United Kingdom, the differences are, I think, getting smaller, not bigger. And so it's a more complex picture. The other thing that's important here is that we looked at the role of multi-level governance in sort of multiculturalism policy and social integration of migrants. And when one takes a look at the complexity of the institutions, the picture becomes even more complex, a little fuzzier. In the main, policies on immigration, multiculturalism, social integration are driven at the national level, at the level of member states in the EU, and in Canada at the federal and provincial level. These issues are driven by national identity, core cultural values, and so in the European context, the Commission's role is operates, they have Commission documents and so on, but whether governments move in one direction or the other in Europe is really being decided at the country level. And it's quite interesting. Europe is becoming more diverse internally. It's not moving to a common European model. Countries are moving further apart. In the Canadian context, when one looks at the multi-level governance, one does see some difference, particularly between Quebec and the rest of the country. Quebec's conception of interculturalism is a little different than the federal multiculturalism strategies. And in both Europe and Canada, when you move down to the municipal level, there you get a lot more difference. Each city has to respond to the demographic character of the local population. So even in countries like France and Germany, which have never adopted multiculturalism as we would understand it at the national level, at the city level, they do, they respond. And the kind of programs that, say, Frankfurt runs look a lot like the programs you find in Toronto. So these images of reasonably coherent cities or countries with a kind of homogeneous approach to these issues becomes a little more complex when you look at the different layers that make up countries. So I guess the bottom line is images of Europe and North America moving apart, when you look more carefully, more complex. Images of individual countries look more complex when you look at the different layers that go on internally. So that's what we've been doing.